Hello and welcome back to Soteriology 101. Today we've got a special guest with us. This is Dr. Ali Bonner. Dr. Bonner, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me on.
Well, Dr. Bonner, you're known for your work on Pelagius, the British monk from the early 5th century, late 4th century. And I appreciate your work because I think it brings a lot of light to an otherwise heated discussion. And you've written a book that's pretty well known among those of us theologians that like to study such things, called The Myth of Pelagianism. And I just want to know a little bit more about your work. Why write on Pelagianism and why title a book The Myth of Pelagianism?
So the reason for writing about it is because Pelagius is the first known British author. And in the longer perspective, I think he had an effect on the history of what was happening within Britain in the late Roman and particularly the post-Roman period. So this is about religious ideas, about what we might call ideologies, but they have a social and potentially political application. So I was studying this and looking at manuscripts and wanted to know what was going on in Britain and wanted to study a British author. And because he was a very important figure, I suspected that there were implications for the history, social and political history and religious history of what was going on in Britain. And therefore, that's why I studied him. That's why I studied Pelagius. But you cannot study Pelagius without obviously then looking at, in my case, manuscripts, because that's what we do in the university and the department where I work, but also the history across Europe and the accusations that were made against him as to what he taught.
So when you talk about the myth of Pelagianism, first, I think for our audience, understanding what is Pelagianism, a lot of laymen may not even know that term. What would you tell them if somebody just walks up and says, what's Pelagianism?
Well, first off, I would say it didn't exist. So I think it's a fictional construct. But that said, we can look carefully at what the ideas, the tenets that were attributed to it. So you can have two separate things. You can say, take the list of ideas, the statements that were attributed to Pelagius and to this group that was alleged to exist. So Augustine described it as a new and very dangerous heresy, and he repeatedly described it as that. And he set out the tenets that he felt constituted it. But there are also church councils which declare anathemata, declare heretical certain theses, certain statements. So we can look at those collections of statements as well, and we can say, this is what they thought they were condemning. So this is what they thought it was. And then there is actually also, from later ecumenical councils, again, another statement of what constitutes this evil that we've got to suppress and put down. So we do have lists of tenets, of ideas. Now, the reason I wrote The Myth of Pelagianism is because 5 main reasons, but the first is a disjunction between what those statements say and what's in Pelagius's writings. So that there is, of the 14 statements, half of one is something that's actually found in Pelagius's writings. 7 are flatly contradicted by him. And the half of one is that grace is given in accord with merit. Now, the second argument for saying it didn't exist is that everything he wrote had already been written at length, in detail, particularly by Greek authors, but also by other authors translating the Greek authors into Latin, so Rufinus of Aquileia. So the one thing he did actually say that corresponds with the tenets had been written and was actually consensus view amongst a particular version of Christianity, which is Eastern ascetic Christianity. Now, in the Latin world, in Rome and Italy, the Greek fathers had huge authority amongst many Christians. They really did have enormous authority, and it was possible to earn a living translating, recycling, reworking those Greek fathers of the East, Athanasius of Alexandria, the Cappadocian fathers, Basil the Great, Chrysostom's the next generation. Ambrose translated, Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, late 4th century, 370s, 380s. He's translated Basil's Hexameron. It's not a close translation, it's a reworking of Basil, but it was possible to earn a living doing this. So someone like Rufinus of Aquileia did that. Jerome built a career on translating this Greek ascetic theology. Cassian of Marseille did the same thing. Pelagius was just one of many authors doing this. So nothing in Pelagius is original. Nothing. What that means is he can't have invented a new set of ideas. So those are the two principal ones. There are other things, but the two principal ones are those.
So just to recap, it sounds like it's a straw man, is what I put it in modern day vernacular in the way we would talk. Yeah. It was a straw man. In other words, it really wasn't what Pelagius actually taught. So yeah. The danger of it wasn't really all that dangerous because it was a straw man. And then two, it's not new. It's nothing unique to Pelagius. It was orthodox, in other words, at that time in history.
Yeah. If you read Rowan Greer in his Fear of Freedom, he describes Augustine's theology as a new theology that broke with the dominant Christian ideology of the 4th century, which he described as the Platonic pursuit, a Christianized version of the Platonic pursuit of virtue. And Greer backed that up by looking extensively, for example, at Ambrose of Milan to say, Ambrose of Milan argues for effective free will. That's free will to evil and to goodness. Ambrose of Milan bases his ideas on that. And so that's why Rowan Greer said, right, this is the 4th century consensus, and it is radically altered by Augustine of Hippo.
Wow. Okay, well, my listeners know that I'm a systematic theologian. That's what my training is. And so I grew up believing and being taught in my seminary classes and even in my undergraduate work and Bible that Pelagian or Pelagianism was this concept and idea, one, that we're basically good, that we're born basically good people. Everybody's naturally pretty good. We're not all that bad. And then secondly, that we can earn our salvation by our own good deeds, that we merit salvation. We don't really need God's help. We can do this on our own. Salvation can be earned through merit and through good deeds, and anybody can do that from birth because we're all basically pretty good people. As long as we don't let sin get the best of us, we can just basically do good. And that the initiative is not God's on salvation, but man's. Man is the one who ultimately initiates the process of salvation. And so that's this rank Pelagianism, which to me, I've just abhorred that. I thought that's absolutely humanistic. It's horrible. It is bad.
You would.
Are all those straw men, or is that really what Pelagius taught?
No, essentially. John Henderson identified that the genius of neo. He looked at religions and how they change, how doctrine develops, and he said the genius of neo-orthodoxy is it conceals its newness. So this is the invention of heresy in order to relocate orthodoxy. So if you want to develop a religion, and religions need to develop. I mean, Protestantism is, Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, if it isn't Lutheranism, if it doesn't keep changing. So Henderson argued, look at this across several religions, and you'll see this is what always happens. In order to take doctrine forward, you need to you need to get the consensus moved out of being the consensus. So you need to suggest it's dangerous, and then you can introduce new doctrine. And you do that by saying, actually, this is what's always been believed. So the thing about the heresy accusations is they suggest that it's heresy, the new ideas are presented as what's actually standard, and that anybody who denies those is denying what is the furniture and has always been part of Christianity. Therefore, to deny predestination interpreted as preordainment, to deny original sin, that's heresy. But actually, this is the process of installing new ideas as orthodoxy. So the things you've described, of course they're not, of course they're objectionable, but they were designed to be objectionable. So the stigma of arrogance, of not needing God, that's a very clever label, enemy of grace, which basically means enemy of God. That's a very clever polemical strategy to label some as the enemy of grace. So there I went back to look at what does grace mean? And there are lots of meanings. It's any gift in the 4th century and in the early 5th century. It's any gift that God gives to man. And that covers Jesus' coming, Jesus' teaching, Jesus' passion, his suffering, his redemption of our sins. It covers creation. It covers us created with free will. It covers special gifts of healing or speaking in tongues. It covers a range of things, but it is synonymous with gift. And most of those things are unearned. They're general gifts to humanity that we couldn't possibly earn. We could never deserve. They are unearned free gifts. So I looked at grace and how the term was used. And in fact, Pelagius uses the term grace a great deal. Now, you could say in some respects, he was, some of this is after he became aware of being accused of not acknowledging grace. But the one meaning of grace that does not occur before Augustine is grace as an absolutist form of prevenient grace. So prevenient means it comes first. It initiates virtue. And an absolute form of prevenient grace means that nothing else can cause human virtue, and that this virtue is irresistible, meaning there's no human consent, there's no human participation. All virtue, and this is what's specific, this is not just prevenient grace, this is an absolutist account of prevenient grace. So it means it's irresistible, you don't play any part in it, and it causes all human virtue, and there is no human participation. And that then triggers the corollary that predestination, which had up until that point always been interpreted as God's foreknowledge of human actions that were in some way autonomous, even if it's a tiny amount, should be interpreted as preordainment. And that's where the notion of the elect comes from. Now, I'm not arguing theologically what's right and wrong, because all of these arguments are grounded in Scripture. They're all immanent in Scripture. You can defend these positions from Scripture. I'm simply saying, what Rowan Greer pointed out, but I would argue also, this particular account of an absolutist account of prevenient grace and predestination interpreted as preordainment, which requires original sin to mean it must happen, because it's because of original sin that humans can't act virtuously without the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. That is something new. Now, if you then go to Pelagius' writings, he talked about grace a great deal. He also talked about cooperation. And in a letter which is written on this very subject called On the Divine Law, he actually talks about, I don't want to make grace graceless. And he says, we need to go for moderation and cooperation. And grace indeed dismisses sins for free, gratuitously, but with the consent and the will of the believer. So what he was arguing for, he was standing up to defend what had been 4th century, it was the standard consensus at the time. So he wasn't introducing new doctrine, he was defending what was Greek ascetic theology. Read Basil of Caesarea, and read Ambrose. Ambrose is Roman, but read Basil of Caesarea, read Athanasius of Alexandria, and effective free will is taken for granted, and human nature. In fact, Athanasius of Alexandria is much more positive about human nature, but Athanasius and Basil of Caesarea, they corresponded, and there are some echoes between Basil echoes Athanasius, as indeed Pelagius does. So what I was saying was that a new interpretation of grace has come along, and Pelagius does refer to grace, and he does argue for a cooperative model. In fact, in his statement of faith, the last thing he sent to the papacy in his dossier of documents to defend himself, he says, I believe in free will in such a way that we always have need of God's grace. So to suggest that he excluded God's grace, that he was an enemy of grace, or that he thought you didn't need God, at this point, Leighton, I have to say, what really matters is to go and read Pelagius' writings. If you go and read the 4 letters that we absolutely know he wrote, letter to Demetrias, on the divine law, letter to Calantia, and on virginity, it's very clear he would be he never says we don't need God. You cannot find that in Pelagius' writings. That's why I would say that the account that you were taught of what Pelagianism is was a very effective smear campaign. Yeah, did a very good job. It created this toxic caricature that didn't need God, but it's not. You can't find it in Pelagius' writings. And at this point, I would point out that when Augustine was scouring through Pelagius' writings to find material to use against Pelagius to show that he was arrogant, that he did argue that you didn't need God, that he thought you could do all of this, but you could be virtuous by yourself. He looked at works that we don't now have on nature and on free will. As I say, 2 works by Pelagius that don't survive. And the most that Augustine could find, the most incriminating thing he could find, was something that actually stated the opposite, that stated that we did need God's help all the time. And Augustine had to say, and of course here he's lying. He's not telling the truth. So I think if Augustine couldn't find any, smoking gun triggers to show that Pelagius thought that man didn't need God's help, then I think it shows that that's not what. But we know from the letters that survive that that's not what Pelagius taught.
Dr. Bonner, I'm listening to you, I'm almost tearing up. I mean, I know that's strange when you're talking about a historical event like this, and I don't know why I am. Maybe I didn't sleep very well last night. I don't know. But I know you're not real familiar with my work, but in a lot of ways, when I'm defending as a former Calvinist, now not a Calvinist, there's a lot of things that about what I believe that are maligned on social media, people accusing me of saying things I've never even dreamed of saying. And I feel for him. There's this feeling I'm like going, I know what that feels like. Oh, Leighton, you believe that men are so much better than they really are. You don't really take sin seriously. The arrogance thing that you were talking about, that just kind of you're really trying to just lift up men and make them better than they are. And when in reality, I think that what I'm trying to do is maintain, if anything, the blameworthiness of man by maintaining that they have responsibility. They're not just born that way. They can do otherwise. They have God's grace helping them, and therefore, when they're rejecting God, they're rejecting a God who loves and provides for them, not a God who rejected them before they were ever born and ultimately decreed for them to be born in such a condition that they couldn't even respond to Him in His appeals to be reconciled. I mean, if anything, I'm trying to say men are blameworthy for rejecting God. If anything, in this battering ram of accusation of arrogance or humanism. You're just a humanist. You're whatever cost, you just got to defend the and bow at the altar of the almighty free will of man and give man all this power that he really doesn't ever have. And so I'm hearing you describe in the way that you do what was happening to Pelagius at his time, trying to defend what was commonly held as orthodoxy, being accused of all of these heinous beliefs that you're saying, based upon your studies, he never really taught. And I know exactly how he feels because I'm accused of things I don't believe all the time. And so if there's 14 points that are being accused or charged by Augustine towards Pelagius, and your studies find that only one half of one of those points is legitimate, how did that go unnoticed? In other words, how is it that in the Western world that I live in today, in the year 2000, when I was in seminary, I'm still being taught that Pelagius taught these things? How has that not been noticed?
It's a really good question, Leighton, because I turned to that immediately. I thought, right, so I looked at scholarship, and I looked at people like Giovanni Martinetto, Torgny Bolin, Henri Irénée Marou. Various writers had said, well, of course, Pelagius is just repeating Eastern monastic theology. So they did get to the point where they realized, and Martinetto realized, that Jerome actually switched positions in 414 suddenly, under a threat of heresy himself. So people got to the point of saying this. They got to the point of saying what should have been, this isn't new, but they didn't. What they actually just said, oh, he's just recycling. And Martinetto actually said that Augustine was ignorant of the tradition, the Greek tradition. So they got to the edge of saying it, but they didn't take the next step. So then I thought, why aren't they taking the next step? Actually, it's Rowan Greer who's the one who took the next step and said Augustine created this new theology. But others didn't, even though they were looking at the evidence, and they acknowledged the evidence said that Pelagius could not have invented anything new, that this was all recycled Greek theology. And I think I then came to a range of, I think it's multifactorial. It's not one answer. So part of it is, why did it gain traction in 418? And then the next question is, why has it retained traction ever since? So in 418, there was a collapse in confidence. And Greer looked at wider pictures. He looks at, why is there a shift? Why is there this loss of confidence? Why does a negative account of man get installed? And remember, Pelagius didn't say we were all good. He said we could go either way. And he said it was the long habit of sinning that had ingrained sin such that we thought it was part of human nature. And it made it seem like it had to be an outside force if we ever did anything virtuous, because we were so, he said, we were taught, we were educated in sin. And so he thought it was that habit that caused it to seem like an external force. So I looked at the time, this chronic, the Western Roman Empire is disintegrating. Their armies are being defeated. There is a chronic loss of confidence. Greer looked at bigger things and said we can see what he identified was accentuating God's power and reducing, not being interested anymore in individual freedom. So the individual is coming down in the equation, and God's power is being privileged, is being prioritized. It's a question of what you prioritize. So you might prioritize individual responsibility, or you might prioritize God's power, his omnipotence, which of course might be interpreted as your humility towards God. So you can characterize crediting God with omnipotence, and if you don't say that, then you're not being humble. So then you're being arrogant. So do you see how you can? So Greer just knows he could see these changes happening on the bigger sphere. I think there are other things going on at the time in the early 5th century to do perhaps with the disintegration of the Western Empire. But at any rate, Greer said, look, we can see it's not just, you have to ask the question, is this just Augustine? He must have been pushing at an open door. This has to be a wider movement. And of course, historians would say that when you look at theological texts, actually, they're all arguing about justice. And because they project onto God what actually their own ideal of what is justice. And so they're actually, in a way, a reflection of politics. And therefore, that's why historians have taken it. There's been a cultural turn in historical studies where they've started to really read religious texts, theological texts, to give them a sense of what currents in thought, broader currents in social and political thought, which ways they're going. So you can situate it at the time in a broader picture and try to find explanations. I think Greer is right that it's wrong to pin it on one person and say this is all Augustine. We can see other things going on towards privileging the community, saints, and moving away from an elite who perhaps no one had any faith in anymore. And that's got my arguments for the administration of the Roman Empire. Magistrates, nobody has a good word to say. No one has a good word to say about the Roman Empire or its administration or magistrates, its officials. So you look at the bigger picture. Now, ever since, I would say partly the authority of Augustine, partly that the accusation has been it's been career-ending. To be accused of Pelagianism, the early Quakers were accused of Pelagianism. So I looked at accusations of Pelagianism. It's a very handy weapon. It gets used down the centuries. If you accuse somebody of it, it's a very effective smear tactic. It tars them with arrogance. It's also very broad. If you look at the apostolic exhortations of 2013 and 2018, issued by the Vatican, it's become almost a catch-all. So it's basically arrogance and not needing God. It's self-sufficiency. Now, at the time, back in 418, the brilliance of saying not needing God was it associated people with the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and those were well-known Christian hobgoblins. They were the apogee of self-sufficiency, of self-righteousness, which is a really toxic accusation. Now, to give you an example of that, one of the tenets attributed to Pelagius is he says that the law gets you to heaven as much as the gospel. If you go to Pelagius's writings, you'll find that he doesn't say that at all. Actually, he follows Paul and says that this is the new grace, the new time of the gospel. And he specifically advises people and says, if you want to know what the law is, go and read the Gospels and you will find there what you should do. So the law is not a code. It's definitely not the Old Testament law, which is what he was being accused of. He was being accused of privileging the Old Testament law in the same way as the Sadducees and the Pharisees did, which again adds to that label of arrogance and self-sufficiency and self-righteousness. But that's not what Pelagius says. He says, read the Gospels. And he actually leaves it to individuals to work out how to interpret the Gospels. He just says, read the Lord's words. That's the law. And he centers it on, and following the Gospels, he centers it on and says, what really matters is love thy neighbour as thyself. That's the golden rule. He says the Lord summed it up in this one rule, love thy neighbour as thyself. And elsewhere he says, always return good for evil, never return, always love everyone. So in Latin, there are several different words for love. And it's not just we have one, but they had several. And Pelagius uses them all. Essentially, he's trying to, this is part Leighton of trying to read him what he was trying to do. So to take him out of this debate with Augustine, not see him through Augustine's eyes and just read his works. If I had to say one thing, it would be go and read Pelagius's letters, particularly his letters where he's explaining what he thinks. Because there he says, it's all about love. It's about imitating Christ. And that means you have to love your neighbour as yourself. Thing is, Leighton, that's very difficult. We might describe it now as unconditional love. It's okay if you withdraw as an ascetic or a hermit, But if you want to live in the world, run a company, work for, if you're going to live in the city, and it was very difficult. And in fact, Christianity went in the direction of the elite who could actually imitate Christ withdrew into ascetic communities, monasteries, or lived as hermits. It was very difficult to do it in a city. And to start off with, Pelagius is really trying to advise people, how do you do it in society without being withdrawn away from humanity by yourself? It's all about how to live unconditional love. And that's not easy. It's not actually simple. It's jolly difficult to
Yeah.
do. And so in my understanding of this is he's defending orthodoxy. He wants to maintain universal salvific will, and universal salvific will is in the Bible. It's in the New Testament and in the Old Testament. That's a real concern. That's a constant concern about predestination interpreted as preordainment. And if you read Pelagius's works, the only law he really refers to is what Jesus said. That's where you'll find the law. And he certainly doesn't privilege the Old Testament.
Well, I want to bring in even the concept of semi-Pelagianism, because that from my readings, and you tell me if I'm wrong here or from your own studies, but I think Theodore Beza in 1577 is the first on record to have used the term semi-Pelagianism as far as we know. And it's used against the rise of Molinists, who are a form of Arminians back in Theodore Beza's time, Calvin's time, a little after Calvin. And semi-Pelagianism, based upon Adam Harwood's work, in fact, I'll put this up on the screen here, where he actually, definitions of semi-Pelagianism, he puts them there on the left side of the screen. The Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, for example, it's maintained that the first steps toward the Christian life were ordinarily taken by the human will, and the grace supervened only later. Evangelical Dictionary of Theology says it's affirmed that the unaided will performed the initial act of faith. In other words, it's unaided. In other words, there's nothing from God there. It starts with man. The priority of the human will over the grace of God is the initial work of salvation. The semi-Pelagians, according to the Integrative Theology, another book, the semi-Pelagians claim that sinners make the first move towards salvation by choosing to repent and believe. Also, the semi-Pelagian scheme of salvation thus may be described by the statement, I started to come and God helped me. In other words, I initiated it, then God's aid stepped in after I started. And that would be semi-Pelagianism, I guess, in his mind, whereas full-on Pelagianism is I never need God's help. But Pelagianism is I never need God's help anytime at all. I can just do everything by myself. And the semi-Pelagianism is you can start, but then God will help you after you initiate. And the last one is the Westminster of all the dictionaries of Westminster is known to be a Calvinistic source. It says a term, defining semi-Pelagianism, a term which has been used to describe several theories which were thought to imply that the first movement towards God is made by human effort, unaided by grace. And so I wanted to present those, four credible, I think unbiased, I guess you could even call it, sources that define what semi-Pelagianism is, and then just ask you, by that standard, was even Pelagius a semi-Pelagian in your estimation?
Okay, so thanks for that question, Leighton, because I think it's really important to discuss this. Now, if I don't think Pelagianism existed, am I going to think that semi-Pelagianism existed? So the answer is no, and I can explain why. So yes, this is counter-Reformation debates. Semi-Pelagianism is another smear. It's basically saying crypto-Pelagianism, and the Jesuits and the Dominicans are it's counter-Reformation. So the Reformation has happened. This is the counter-Reformation, and they're trying to deal with what theology they're going to emerge with, and they don't come to an agreement about it. If we actually look at what they're referring to, we can see it has been located to southern Gaul because there are texts that emerge from there. But actually, I would say there was continuously, from Pelagius's On the Divine Law, this anxiety about predestination interpreted as preordainment. And the anxiety was it contradicted the scriptural statement of God's universal salvific will. And they're not willing to lose. Some Christians, I wouldn't give them a label, because these are Christians. We know from textual evidence they're in Italy. They're not just in southern Gaul. These are Christians who cannot abandon God's universal salvific will. And so they have a problem with Augustine's three statements. So if God has not pre-selected who is going to be saved and who's going to, if he hasn't done that, there has to be some room for human involvement. So I would point out that there were several laws, not just Honorius, the Western Roman Emperor, in 418. There were subsequent laws in the 420s, which made it very difficult for Christians who were bishops or priests to maintain an objection to original sin or publicly. So there's a certain amount of political pressure that's coming on here, but in southern Gaul, we can see texts, for example, Faustus of Riez writes, this is why the notion of semi-Pelagianism was created, is because there are texts that survive. For example, his on De Liber Arbitra, De Gratia Dei, and on the grace of God and free will. And he's trying to maintain God's universal salvific will. What he suggests is heresy is predestination interpreted as preordainment. And remember that Prosper of Aquitaine, who was a real devoted adherent of Augustine, wrote to Augustine a letter saying, I've checked and no previous scriptural expert or exponent has interpreted predestination as preordainment. So even Prosper of Aquitaine, recognized there was a problem with this, that it was new. Well, not there's a problem with it, but it's a new interpretation. So there were Christians who wanted to maintain God's universal salvific will. And you can't do that if you have predestination interpreted as preordainment. If there is no cooperation, no collaboration, no human involvement whatsoever. So I would argue that actually the Western Church, you see, I think in the Western Church there is a sort of cognitive dissonance where they don't acknowledge that actually this has not been resolved. This question, it's not clear. It's still... Actually, Christians in the West very much debate this issue, as you well know. But it's not good to debate it through labels, smear tact, through labels for things that didn't exist. I think perhaps maybe a historical perspective might help. What I can say for a fact is that if you look at the manuscript evidence, two distinct versions of Christianity are transmitted throughout the Middle Ages and into the print era. So there's the version which is the Greek, because they're still valued and revered as writers. So Evagrius of Antioch's translation of Athanasius's Life of Antony becomes an absolute, well, in fact, in Augustine's Confessions, he tells the story of the two people he met in Gaul who read it and their lives were transformed by it. So it became a staple. It was fundamental to Christianity in Britain and Ireland and across the Western Europe. So there are texts carrying on which present that Eastern Celtic theology, and then there's Augustine's text, which became, hugely copied, massively copied. But my point is, these two different versions of Christianity carry on going. Jerome gets massively copied. Hence, Martin Luther says Jerome is a heretic. Jerome and Augustine contradict. That you can't have both. And he comes down on Augustine's side and says Jerome's a heretic, and is amazed that no one has pointed this out before. So I would say Martin Luther was right, that actually this is two different versions of Christianity. Semi-Pelagianism, I don't think it existed. I think this is problems with Augustine's theology that some people can't accept it. They have to maintain God's universal salvific will. They try. I mean, Faustus Riez tries to maintain original sin at the same time as and grace, the importance of grace, but not have predestination interpreted as preordainment. Now, I don't personally think that's a coherent view, because I think the three doctrines are intimately mutually dependent, and you can't have one without having the other two.
Well, then would you say, even though Pelagianism doesn't exist and semi-Pelagianism seems to be just a smear based upon what Pelagianism came to be known as, would you even say, based upon your readings of Pelagius's work, that he would ever say that we initiate salvation through our own wills and then unaided by any measure of grace? Because you even talked about how Pelagius saw grace as much broader than just saving grace, especially irresistible saving grace or sovereign grace or whatever it's called. He saw grace as much broader than that, referring to anything that God gives us as a part of God's grace. Would he then ever say that we would initiate salvation, or that we would come to God unaided by grace? Does that make
Um,
sense?
yeah, it does make sense. He does sometimes say that I mean, I would go with Cassian of Marseille, obviously, is another writer from southern Gaul at this period,
Right.
who writes his Conference 13. And Cassian says, you shouldn't explore this. You shouldn't explore the process. He ends the conference by saying, this is a mystery, and you should not explore the causation. It's both God and man, and you just can't unpick it and be precise as to who exactly is doing it. And that's his solution: is you shouldn't legislate as to which it is. Now, it's true that that many writers had expressed the view that you had a good nature, and then you by using Christianity, you were making yourself. We talk about the image of God and the likeness of God in Basil. He talks about the image of God and the likeness of God, and the image of God is created with free will, created as God has free will, and you make yourself like into the likeness of God by exercising that free will. And one of those things might be choosing Christianity. So yes, it would be possible. I can't name one, but yes, it's possible that he would talk about that. But Pelagius would talk about choosing Christianity. But I think to systematize it and to say that that's a tenet, you see, if you'd asked him, and it's difficult because we've only got the text that survived, nobody pinned him down and asked him, but he did say that you have need of God's help every day, all the time. And so I don't think he'd unpick it. I think he'd say, how can you know? I think, as Cassian said, how can you know what is God and what is the human initiative? Right. God's calling is part of it, and we're all called, and in the end we only choose it because we're called by the Holy Spirit. So how can you?
Right. And that's probably where, at least on the charge of semi-Pelagianism as it's known today, that men like Dr. Harwood and Dr. Allen and myself and others strongly oppose the accusation of semi-Pelagianism, because we believe God initiates. In other words, we believe by sending his son, he initiated. By sending the Holy Spirit to bring conviction to the world, he initiates. In other words, there is no world that a Pelagianism could exist in that sense.
Yes, I think that's it. I think that's absolutely it. And I think it's that broader sense of God, Jesus are always calling you, and therefore, how can you say that it was your own initiative without their help? I think that is. I think that's what. But do you see, in a polemical situation, when people are writing and when there's been a consensus orthodoxy, people are having to then suddenly be really careful about what they're saying, but they might not be terribly careful initially. So that goes for the argument about perfection. So Pelagius was accused of arguing that perfection was possible. No, he argued that it was never possible to be perfect in this life, and you had to keep on striving. But everyone became much more aware of the language of perfection once it had been stigmatized as heretical. Before that, if you look at Jerome, you look at Basil, they're all flinging around the notion. In fact, the Lives of the Desert Fathers and Palladius of Helenopolis, or Spooner, depending on which name you want to give him, he referred to perfections. But it just was it was a word that people used. What they meant was striving for perfection. Because they didn't analyze it, they didn't worry about it and pin it down and qualify it and say, of course, I don't mean actual perfection. I mean, carried on to the end of their life and didn't, got as close as a human being can be to imitating Christ. So I think that there's some language, some words that are used where people are not being careful because they haven't been accused of doing something bad at that point. So I think there's a certain leeway. But if you had, questioned them, they would have said the answer that you said about how can you say he isn't calling, because he's always calling.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and I can relate to that, because there's been times where I've said something less precisely and then accused of believing something I don't believe. And then the next time I say it very precisely because I don't want to be accused of that thing again. So yeah, I can totally understand and relate to that. Now, is it true? And I can't remember if I heard this from you in an interview that you did with Warren McGrew, or maybe read it from you. I don't remember if this is from you or not, so correct me if I'm mistaken on this. But that at some point Augustine pretty much acknowledges that the accusations that he's making towards Pelagius aren't necessarily true, but it doesn't really matter we still need to deem these things as heretical. So let's go ahead and get this through the synod or whatever it may be. Am I mischaracterizing that? Maybe
no,
he says
it. He says it 3 times. He says it 3 times about Pelagius and Caelestius, and once again about Caelestius. So 3 times he says in writing, and particularly there's one in one letter to John of Jerusalem in 416, 2 years before the actual condemnation of Pelagius in 418. And he finishes the letter knowing that knowing that Pelagius would read this letter, because John of Jerusalem was in contact with Pelagius. He finishes it by saying, it doesn't really matter. I don't really care whether or not Pelagius has, not just whether or not Pelagius has ever taught these things, but whether or not he ever changes his mind in the future, whether or not he rejects these ideas. And but if you look at it from Augustine's perspective, what he is saying is it's the bad ideas that need to go. But he's also saying, I don't care whether Pelagius taught them or not. So on the one hand, you could say there's some, Augustine is saying, look, these are bad ideas. They're being circulated. We need to get rid of them.
But were they being circulated? All these bad ideas, if Pelagius didn't teach them and believe them, were they really being circulated?
Well, that's a good question. I don't, not the ones that were being accused of. The idea that there was effective free will, those ideas were there, but those were the real targets. So do you see, if you're trying to introduce new doctrine, you have to stigmatize contemporary doctrine.
Old doctrine.
So no, Rufinus, there's a Rufinus of Syria. There is a text, a Libide Fide by Rufinus of Syria. Now, tracking down who he was, but I think there's a plausible scenario in which he was actually a monk of Jerome's monastery. And at the end of this Libide Fide, there is a statement that Adam was born mortal and would have died whether or not he'd sinned. So one of those accusations against Pelagius, which has nothing to do with Pelagius, was an idea that we know was when I say in circulation, it survives in this one text. There's no indication that anybody else thought it, but it was clearly something that someone thought. Ironically, someone who may have been a monk in one of Jerome's monasteries and may have been used as a messenger by Jerome, sent to Italy with letters. So that, we can say that idea was, at least one person was writing it. Some of the ideas, the rich can't get into heaven, that was definitely circulating. Jerome says it's circulating on islands in the Mediterranean. But that we can take back to Basil and Chrysostom and say these ideas are coming from the Greek East and they are being circulated. So yes, some of the ideas are circulating. In answer to your question, some of them are.
Right. And for those that don't know, that was one of the accusations that Augustine brought against Pelagius's teaching, was that rich people can't be saved. Is that correct?
Yes, that's one of the tenets that,
Okay. And so there was a lot more above and beyond our soteriological issues. There were other accusations being brought. And so it sounds like what you're saying, just kind of a recap, is that Pelagius, for the most part, wasn't believing or teaching anything new with regard to free will and soteriology. But Augustine was caricaturing, or you could say straw manning, his more orthodox position so as to make his more believable, or in order to introduce his particular views with regard to predestination as preordained of certain individuals for salvation. Would that be accurate? Okay.
Augustine is reading entailments into Pelagius's writings, and he's using ideas that are in circulation, which are objectionable, in order to create, to vilify Pelagius. And then what he's doing in the church synods is creating the suggestion, the implication that his 3 ideas, the ideas that he's saying are fundamental to Christianity. So sorry, shouldn't refer to them as his ideas. These biblical ideas that Augustine is prioritizing, which are original sin, an absolutist account of prevenient grace, and predestination interpreted as preordainment. He's presenting that any objection to those as being heresy. And what that does is it implies that those 3 ideas are established orthodoxy, that they are church dogma that is recognized. So if anybody denies those or questions those, they are heretics. So what that does is it creates the perception, the suggestion, and if it gets passed as a synod and there's a law against it, against denial of original sin, by, that's what Honorius's rescript does in 418, then you're creating the perception that orthodoxy is original sin, predestination interpreted as preordainment, and an absolutist account of prevenient grace. Do you see how that works? So you get a bad set of ideas and accusation of arrogance, you attribute them to someone who is defending the consensus, and then you can introduce your ideas and say, look, he's denying these new ideas, therefore he's a heretic, therefore these aren't new ideas, these are antique ideas in the church. He's the one inventing the new ideas.
Now, again, from my background, which is limited when it comes to the historical uses of these terms, but original sin, again, for a systematic theologian taught in a seminary in around 2000, I'm taught that means that there's sin that corrupts us. Because of the fall, we have corruption of sin, and we need a savior. And I still today, even on my broadcast, defend that I believe in original sin, but maybe not the way Augustine necessarily taught it. I believe we need a savior, but I don't believe that original sin makes us such that we can't confess that we have corruption, and that we can't confess in light of the gospel that we need a savior. In other words, I don't think that the fall causes us to lose our responsibility, our ability to respond to the grace proffered by the gospel. And so that's been my defense of saying, I believe in a form of original sin, insofar as original sin means that Adam originally sinned and it affects us, but it doesn't affect us in such a way that removes our ability to respond to God's own offer of reconciliation. And so maybe historically help us to understand when the term original sin was first being debated, what was meant then, and why it would have Pelagius disagreed with it, and why. Maybe help us to understand that historically.
Well, I'm not an absolute expert on when it was first coined, but I would point to what I have read in Basil, where he refers to this sin, and says Basil is trying to persuade the rich to give money away when there's a famine in Caesarea, and he says, give money and it will wipe away that sin. So he thought, so it's not that there wasn't an original sin that Adam committed. It's that what does it still hold us? Does it still absolutely mean we can't be virtuous? So Basil very clearly told his congregation that if they gave money if they helped out the poor who were had no food, that would wipe away the sin. So obviously it's something that is not ingrained and can't be removed. So Pelagius argued that man was recreated by Jesus's coming to the same extent as man had been dragged down by Adam's fall. So he would have, what he says is that, I suppose what he would say, I'm putting words in his mouth, but what he's saying is that it misunderstands God's purpose in coming down on earth and inhabiting a human, being a human. If you don't understand, it diminishes Jesus's purpose, his activity, his effect, because for Pelagius, Jesus creates the new man to the same extent that Adam had reduced us down into the dust. So do you see, you're not understanding Jesus's achievement, what Jesus did, if you don't credit him with wiping away Adam's sin. Because for Pelagius, man has been so recreated by Christ's coming that he's no longer held in chains by Adam's sin.
So would that be why sometimes Pelagianism is accused of, well, we become like Adam was in the garden because of what Jesus did? We now become like Adam, perfectly innocent when we're born, just like Adam was, and that we're, in other words, there's no effects of the original sin or original fall because of Christ's coming. Would that be pretty accurate?
No, see, this is reading something into him that he didn't write. I think you could take that as an entailment, but I would just be careful, because what he actually says is no human being can be perfect. One reason for looking at it from a historical perspective is to try to understand, by starting from Pelagius's writings, and understand what he was trying to do, what his purpose was, what his agenda was. So it was to create the kingdom of God. It was to create what Christ was, the community that Christ was advocating on earth, which is, how do you imitate Christ? How do you live Christ advised? And that's building the kingdom of heaven on earth. if we could all do it. It's not saying it can be done or that the church is without spot and wrinkle, but saying that that's what we should aim for. So I don't think I don't think one has to read the entailment that you are going to be like Adam was in the Garden of Eden before he sinned. It's just that Jesus has given you the capacity. He has taught you how you should be able to do this. And it's therefore, if you want to imitate Christ, if this is what you should be trying to do, but not necessarily that you're going to be able to achieve it.
Especially without his help. Yeah, no, yeah, especially without his help, because he would never say you can do it without his help, which is what he's being accused of saying. And so, okay, and I
can see where that might come from, but I don't. Right. I think it's reading something into it that's not there.
It's making more binary. It's kind of, as whenever there's debates, it makes things real binary, like you're either here or here, and there's only those two options. And really, there's, as you well know, there's a lot of gray area in that. And I think any objective observer of history, which history is important because we have a tendency to repeat the errors of our past, and so it's good to know how these things have fleshed themselves out over the years. But anybody, I think, objectively looking back at this would say there's some things that I agree with what Pelagius taught and said, and there's other things that I may not agree with. But the same is true of Augustine. There's a lot of what Augustine said that I absolutely would say is great and I agree with. But there's a lot of what he would say that I wouldn't agree with. And I think even my Calvinistic friends would say the same thing. After all, Augustine believed in baptismal regeneration of infants, and I know very few Calvinists who actually still hold to that. He also believed you could lose your salvation. From what I've understood of Augustine, which I know Calvinists don't even believe that. Even many of us as Southern Baptists don't even believe that. So there's a lot of things that I think if you don't just take it as this binary Pelagius versus Augustine, and Pelagius held to all of these horrible bad things that he's accused of holding to, and Augustine held to all these great perfect doctrines, and we as Augustinians hold to, I think true objective theologians and historians would look back and go, no, both of these were mere men. They were fallible. They made statements that we would agree with and other statements that we wouldn't agree with, and creating this binary debate that often is happening in our Western world is not real healthy to have a good theological discussion or even an understanding of what was happening at that time. Would that be pretty accurate?
Absolutely. I think it's the creation of a false binary, this polarity between two binaries, that's what Augustine has to do. He has to situate Pelagius on the side of never needing God at all in order to vilify him. It's a rhetorical strategy. What a historian would look at would be, as you say, what is the political background, but also what are the rhetorical strategies. So you look at a text and you see how are they rhetorically persuading people? Is there leverage of persuasion, and to frighten people, to set up a straw man, to say this is dangerous, because dangerous is a word that is closely associated with Pelagius. He's a wolf ravening the sheep of the Lord's flock. This has to be characterized as dangerous in order to trigger a legislative response. It's dangerous, therefore we have to do something about it. We have to condemn this person. So yes, it's not a binary choice. It's definitely not a binary choice. And if you want to know that, if you want to see the evidence of that, simply read Pelagius's letters, because it's clearly he refers to grace, and he does not, if you read his letters, you really would not come away with the impression of someone who thinks we don't need God and we don't need grace, because it's just not what he says.
I think this is exactly what I wanted to get out of this interview, in learning from our history, mistakes that are made in our history, not to repeat those same mistakes. The type of people who led us into the Inquisitions were the type of people who used this kind of rhetoric to anger people towards, quote unquote, dangerous beliefs on the other side, which may have some dangerous aspects to them. No doubt there are some dangerous beliefs and doctrines out there. But when we're accusing people who are good Christian people, who really do believe the Bible and are striving with genuine faith to follow God the best way they know how, and you're what you said earlier, under that threat of heresy, there's a lot of people who are willing to do anything and to say anything to get out from underneath that threat of heresy. I see it all too often, of this fear of being accused of with the boogeyman of Pelagianism. It reminds me, I don't know, Dr. Bonner, if you would relate to this as well there in across the pond, so to speak, but in our political world, oftentimes you see people related to Hitler because Hitler is the known boogeyman. He's the bad guy. He's the bad character. And it's a form of ad hominem. It's a, ad hominem is attacking the character of your opponent, saying he's a wife beater, or he's a horrible, he cheats on his taxes, whatever it is, it's attacking the character of your opponent. Well, if the character of your opponent is unimpeached, in other words, he's a good person himself, if I can attach him to a known boogeyman, a known bad character, like, oh, he taught something that Hitler said once, therefore I am attacking his character by associating him with someone who's known to be a bad character. It seems like to me that's happened in our theological environment, where instead of having an in-depth, honest theological discussion over this very controversial and difficult concept of how God, who is infinite and all-powerful, works with finite, limited creatures, instead I will label you with this known boogeyman label so that I don't really have to deal with you anymore. That's what it feels like to me. That seems like what's happened in history based upon your studies. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly what happened. The sadness of the fact that Augustine, he says, I saw Pelagius in Carthage briefly across the marketplace. The sadness of the fact they never sat down and had a conversation, because had they actually talked to each other, I don't think they would. I think they would have. This never would have happened. They might have disagreed, but they wouldn't have attacked. Pelagius didn't attack Augustine, but I think a lot would have been saved if they'd actually sat down, I suppose, and talked.
Wait. So, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I try not to do that, but you just said something I have to jump on. Pelagius never attacked Augustine?
No, the only time. No, you see, this is the thing about returning good for evil. The only time, the closest he gets, is in Letter to Demetrias. I mean, there are two works we have of his that don't survive. So I don't know what's in De on his on free will and his on nature. But in Letter to Demetrias, he writes about the need for clerics to strive to imitate Christ. And the closest he gets is to saying, and indeed even some bishops don't follow this rule about love thy neighbor. Now, I read that as a subtext, a possible implication of watch out for, because remember, Demetrias is in North Africa at the time when she's receiving this letter. So, and we know that Augustine is in correspondence with her mother, not to say also grandmother. So I read that as potentially that's the close. Well, it's the only time there's anything that might even come close to being a criticism of Augustine. And remember that at the time it was being named as, Augustine wrote a letter naming Pelagius as a heretic to Demetrias's mother. So,
and he doesn't return in kind. He doesn't ever name Augustine.
Not that survives. And also, I think that Augustine had actually been attacking him from quite a bit earlier, from sort of 410, 411ish. No, it's interesting, but it's later on. Anianus of Salida and Julian of Eclanum, what they really concerned about is this: do you actually love thy neighbor as thyself, and do to other people as you would wish that they did to you? Do you stick to that golden rule? And so attacking Pelagius by name and vilifying him was, you can see why they felt so strongly about it. But then, of course, both Julian of Eclanum and Augustine of Hippo trade real abuse. Then neither of them behaved in a Christian manner. So I think Pelagius did, as far as we know, but some other text might come to light that shows him throwing abuse at Augustine or naming Augustine and criticizing him.
Let me be a devil's advocate here real quick, because I've heard this actually said to me when I've brought up some of these same issues. It doesn't really matter. I mean, yes, okay, sometimes labels of people get put onto certain heretical doctrines, and it really wasn't fairly represented of that person, but that's irrelevant now. It is what it is. Yes, okay, maybe Pelagius didn't actually teach the things he was accused of teaching, but like Augustine said, they're bad ideas and they need to be squelched anyway. And so that's the point. And so we recognize historically it's been proven Pelagius didn't teach these things, but that's what everybody already knows. It's called Pelagianism. That's what they know it means. And so just stop nitpicking it. It's not that big of a deal. It's just a label. What would you say to somebody who says that?
I'd say that the problem with a label, the problem with using the word, is it assumes that this thing existed. And let's be clear, it wasn't a new set of ideas. There was no group. There was no worrying, threatening group. Pelagius himself didn't teach it. And you're missing what's actually going on. Because the whole point of the invention of the term, that's why the term was coined, that's why they termed it enemy of grace, is to introduce new doctrine, to move doctrine forward. And you miss that that's what's happening. If you use the term Pelagianism, you are misrepresenting the history of what actually happened. So what actually happened is that three doctrines are newly privileged. Sorry, it is really important to be careful about one's words. So these interlinked doctrines are introduced into mainstream consensus, and it becomes illegitimate. You become open to an accusation if you have a confident, positive account of human nature. And if you argue for effective free will, or you argue against original sin. So in a sense, debate has been shut down. Now, it's important to understand the actual historical process and to understand that that's how religions work. Those are really, you talked earlier about valuable historical lessons. Now, I take the point that there might be bad ideas in circulation that need to be squashed. But why can't you argue against those in open synods? Julian of Clarendon argued there should have been a synod in Italy. Now, of course, with barbarians running all over Italy after 401, that was not a realistic possibility. But there is a difference here between, you see, I think it set up this long-term cognitive dissonance within Western Christianity. Eastern Orthodox Christianity doesn't have this problem because they simply don't think the fall created original sin. They think it created a dissonance between God and man, a cosmic divide, but they don't see it as something that's physically transmitted through procreation, through human procreation from individual to the next generation. So I would say don't misrepresent, give an untrue account of the actual process that occurred, because really important to know that what happened was these new privileging of these three ideas is brought in. And that's why someone is vilified. So if you're going to learn from history, you need to be accurate about what actually happened. And I also think that just read Pelagius's writings, and why are you saying untruths about? There is a certain element here of why say untruths, but I think it's the historical process. And then, as Greer pointed out, what does this tell us about politics? What does it tell us about society? Not just about how religion works, but about why suddenly lose confidence? Why suddenly, why is it until the Renaissance impossible to say that human nature is good and to have a confident account of human nature? When Occam's supporters are trying to bring in new ideas, they are introducing the idea of some form of free will. I think we can see bigger historical processes, and it's really important to learn from them. But if you go with an account of what happened that is actually untrue, then you're never going to learn the lessons of history.
Wow. Well, and the way I reply to that particular gentleman is I use his last name. I won't give his last name for privacy's sake because I didn't get his permission to. But if I were talking to you, for example, Dr. Bonner, I might say, well, how would you like something to be called Bonnerism that has nothing to do with what you actually teach, as deemed as heretical and deemed as horribly bad theology and something against what the Bible actually teaches? You wouldn't want the label Bonnerism onto that for the rest of human existence. So do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Why would you put a label of somebody that didn't teach that thing? I mean, assuming Pelagius is in heaven, which I believe based upon the writings I've read of Pelagius, he was a true believer and will be in heaven. You're going to have to do a lot of apologizing to the man when you get there, assuming that what you're saying about him is inaccurate. And if nothing else, just good Christ-like behavior should dictate that you would stop using that label to when it's been proven, demonstrated, because of the technology we have. I mean, I think you mentioned that in your interview with Warren, that we didn't have a lot of the writings translated and at our fingertips like we do today. Is that true? I mean, we have a lot more now than we did in the past.
Absolutely. Late 19th century, his works were rediscovered as his, and then the digitization of manuscripts. Yes, absolutely. It's only a 20th century It's been made possible by technology, particularly recently. I think that's a really good point you make about Bonnerism. The other thing about bad ideas is if there are bad ideas, it's perfectly possible to argue against them and defeat them. You don't have to create a myth. You don't have to say things that aren't true. If they're genuinely bad ideas, arrogance is a bad idea. The irony is that the least arrogant person you could come across is Pelagius, according to his writings. And if his On Free Will or whatever, or On Nature, was to be found, a manuscript copy of it, and he turned out to be arrogant, hands up, I'd say, actually, you know what? Turns out he was an arrogant character. But from the writings that we have, that's the furthest thing from the truth. It's all about how do you live unconditional love in an environment where you're with other people, because it's how do you imitate Christ, because it's not easy. There are many choices that are difficult and difficult conversations you have to have, and how do you do it? And that's the agenda. It's based on an absolute adoration and love of the Gospels and wanting to imitate Christ, wanting to understand how to do it.
Wow. This has been so helpful. Dr. Bonner, your work is actually speaking into, I think, a very practical doctrine within especially Western Christianity and what I deal with on a regular basis. And so I appreciate your time today. I appreciate the fact that you're willing to speak about an issue that sometimes would get you labeled in and of itself. I already can hear the interlocutors in my mind saying, oh, look, we've been accusing him of being a Pelagian all along. And look, he's got the scholar on defending Pelagius himself, proving, oh, yes, he is exactly what we said he is. He is the Pelagian defender. He is the Pelagian himself. I can already hear that. And so, but I think what you've pointed out is, what do they mean by that when they call me a Pelagian? Do they mean the 14 points of which all of which one half of the point were denied by Pelagius himself? Or do they mean what they've come to know what Pelagianism is based upon those false accusations and the straw men? And I think we as good Christian brothers and sisters should represent other brothers and sisters as fairly as possible. And it sounds like you're willing to do that objectively, and say, let's actually go to the source. Let's actually listen to a Christian for himself and his own writings before we label and dismiss them, or before we strawman them and misalign their writings and their teachings. And I would hope that some of the Calvinist friends that I have, who I know are good objective Calvinists, would be willing to come out and say, though I may side more with Augustine on some of these soteriological matters, I think he did poorly in that discussion. I think he did the wrong thing, because I think that's what a good Christian should do. I don't think he should be so locked into his theological vantage point that he can't be objective to call out bad when he sees bad. In the same way, if I saw somebody on my side of the aisle theologically misaligning or misrepresenting somebody, that I should be able to call out that as evil and bad, regardless of where I stand theologically. And my understanding is that you really didn't approach this study from a theological vantage point. Is that correct? I mean, you didn't have an active rank, so to speak.
I don't, and I still don't. I'm not trying to say what's right and wrong theologically. That's not. I'm just looking at the historical context and what the texts. Because as a historian, you're interested in what the texts are saying, and you analyze them very closely. So I would start from the texts and manuscripts and the politics and what's happening at the time, and look at all the letter collection, look at this is a really broad range of texts. I always think you need to read Rufinus of Aquileia, you need to read Basil, you need to read the Greek and the Latin, from the West in Gaul, to Ambrose in Milan, to Evagrius of Antioch, to Jerome in Palestine, to Athanasius in Alexandria. You need to really, really read a wide range of texts, and then you get that historical perspective. But theologically, I really am not trying to tell people what's right and wrong. I would have no problem with someone saying that they do actually think that Augustine's correct in some way, and that they might find a way of making those three doctrines, of believing them. I wouldn't object to them. Personally, I think that a negative account of human nature is damaging. I think that when Pelagius argues that a general, the best thing he can do for his men is explain to them that they can win the battle. And that's why he's saying that that's his explanation as to why he thinks free will is important, and why he thinks the goodness of human nature is that you can go either way, but you can do this. He thinks that's a fundamental you have to start with.
God's help. You can.
Yes, absolutely. You can do it with God's help. Sorry, but I mean but it's not impossible. It's not something you can't do. It's doable. Right. Is essentially you can imitate Christ is what he's going to start from. So I think
that goes to the specificity you were talking about earlier, because I know what people are going to say based upon, she just now said he said he could
sorry,
do it. And then I jump in there and go, wait, with God's help, of course, because I know what the objector is going to say now based upon.
And you have to read the whole of the letter. You can't just take that little. Sorry, you can't take that little bit, but you can see where he's coming from. You can see that he's trying to build the kingdom of. He's trying to get people to behave as Christ advised, and talking about how can you do it. Can it be done, and can we really live this way?
Wow. Well, thank you, Dr. Bonner. The Myth of Pelagianism, I encourage our listeners to go buy that. The next time you're accused of being a Pelagian or semi-Pelagianism, just hand them Dr. Bonner's book and just say, hey, why don't we get educated on this? Be a great way for us to have this conversation and to be objective. But thank you, Dr. Bonner. If you'll hang on just for 1 second, I'll have this closing out here. I want to talk to you a little bit more after this, but I just want to thank you again for coming on the program. Appreciate you very much.
Thank you for having me.